Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're cracking the code on exactly how scientists organize the overwhelming, truly incredible diversity of life on Earth into a neat, logical biological library. Imagine walking into a massive building with millions of books just dumped into chaotic, towering piles all over the floor. You wouldn't be able to find a single thing, right? Well, that's exactly what the natural world would look like without taxonomy. With over 8 million species currently sharing this planet with us, and millions more likely just waiting to be discovered out there, we desperately need a rigorous system. So our goal today is to dive in and understand the exact framework that brings total order to all that overwhelming biological chaos. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start by defining life, move right into the name game, explore the taxonomic hierarchy, break down the 5 kingdoms, and finally look at how we go about preserving all this biological diversity. All right, part 1, what actually defines the living? Let's tackle this fundamental question right off the bat.
Think about this assertion for a second. If an object grows and reproduces, does that give us the ultimate foolproof definition of life? I know, it sounds perfectly logical at first glance, but in biology, we have to be incredibly precise with our definitions. Take a crystal in a cave, for example. It can technically grow by accumulating mass and minerals on its outside surface over a long period of time. Yet we all intuitively know a rock crystal isn't alive. True biological growth happens from within, driven by complex internal processes like cellular division. So it's not just about getting bigger, it's about exactly how you get bigger.
So it turns out that growth and reproduction are actually considered non-defining properties of life. Why? Because you've always got to account for the biological exceptions. Think about a mule or maybe a sterile worker bee. They absolutely cannot reproduce, but they are undisputedly energetically alive. So what are the true, non-negotiable defining traits? First up is metabolism. That's the constant, thousands of simultaneous chemical reactions powering us from the inside every single second. Second is cellular organization, because life is always built from the foundational block of this cell. And finally, consciousness. Now, in a strict biological context, that just means the innate, hardwired ability to sense and respond to environmental stimuli. That's true whether you're a complex mammal or just a single-celled bacteria moving toward a food source. Moving right along to part 2, the rules of the name game. Enter our first major hero of taxonomy, Carolus Linnaeus. Back in the 18th century, he gave us something called binomial nomenclature. Bi simply meaning two, and nomial meaning name. It is a brilliant, universal 2-word naming system made up of a generic name and a specific epithet. Before Linnaeus came along, a single species of bird or a local medicinal plant might literally have 50 different common names depending on which village or country you happen to be standing in. You can imagine the absolute disastrous consequences in early medicine or agriculture if 2 people use the exact same common name for completely different plants, where one is a cure and the other is highly toxic. Linnaeus eliminated all that local language confusion by creating a standardized, universal scientific passport for every single living thing. Now, to actually name a new book in our biological library, we've got to follow some incredibly strict universal rules supervised by international bodies like the ICBN for plants and the ICZN for animals. They're the gatekeepers ensuring no 2 species ever get the same name. And the names themselves? They're always Latinized. There is a highly practical reason for this. Latin is a dead language. Because nobody speaks it colloquially at the grocery store today, it doesn't evolve, adapt, or change over time with slang. The definition of a Latin word is locked in forever, which ensures total scientific consistency across centuries. Formatting-wise, the genus always comes first and is capitalized, while the specific species comes second in completely lowercase letters. Oh, and whether printed in a book or on a screen, they must always be italicized to show their Latin origin or explicitly underlined if you're writing them out by hand. Let's see how these strict rules play out in action. Take this classic example, Mangifera indica. You probably know it much better as the absolutely delicious mango tree. Notice that capital M for the genus Mangifera, the lowercase I for the specific species indica, and the distinct italics separating it from normal text. But what about that little lin sitting right at the very end? That's called an author citation. It's basically a way of proudly crediting Carolus Linnaeus for being the very first person in history to officially scientifically describe and name the mango tree. It permanently ties his legacy to the species itself, which is pretty cool. All right, let's jump into part 3, the taxonomic hierarchy. If you want to truly master taxonomy, you have to memorize the hierarchy. And there is a fantastic,
kind of bizarre trick to remember these ranks in perfect order. It's this mnemonic. King Philip came over for good soup. Just say it a few times in your head. Trust me, you'll never forget the order of classification again.
Those memorable words correspond perfectly to our taxonomic hierarchy, reading from the absolute broadest category down to the most highly specific. We've got kingdom, phylum for animals or division for plants, class, order, family, genus, and finally, species. Think of it exactly like an international mailing address. The kingdom is the massive country you live in, while the species is the very specific house on your exact street. And remember this fundamental rule. The lower down the taxia you go, as you move closer and closer to that individual species level, the more highly specific shared characteristics the members have in common. Conversely, the higher up the hierarchy you go, the harder it becomes to determine precise evolutionary relationships because the categories just get vastly generalized. Which brings us nicely to part 4, the 5 kingdoms. Let's break down 3 of the most diverse and fundamentally fascinating kingdoms from R.H. Whitaker's widely taught 5-kingdom classification system. It's wild how starkly different they are on a cellular level. First, you have Monera. This contains prokaryotes, like bacteria, meaning their cells are super primitive and completely lack a true bound nucleus. Then you step up to Protista. These organisms are also primarily single-celled, but they represent a massive evolutionary leap because they're eukaryotes. They possess a true, well-defined nucleus holding their genetic material, just like an amoeba. And then there are fungi. These are saprophytic decomposers feeding on dead organic matter. They uniquely feature incredibly tough cell walls made of chitin. Fun fact, chitin is the exact same robust material found in the exoskeletons of crabs and insects, making fungi totally unlike the cellulose-based cell walls found in your standard everyday plants. But taking it one step further, let's look at a broader, more modern perspective. Back in 1990, driven by some truly revolutionary deep genetic analysis, Carl Woese proposed 3 massive domains that sit entirely above and overarch all of those traditional kingdoms. By looking super closely at the genetic coding, he realized that what we used to think were just standard bacteria were actually 2 completely different, deeply distinct evolutionary groups. So he split them. He created archaea, which are basically the ultimate biological survivalists, capable of thriving in boiling hot springs, highly acidic lakes, or intensely salty environments, and regular, true bacteria. Everything else on Earth with a complex cell, from a microscopic yeast cell to a giant redwood tree, right up to you and me, gets grouped together under the single massive domain called eukarya. Finally, let's explore part 5, preserving biological diversity. To safely preserve all this expertly cataloged life for future generations, we rely on vital physical storehouses known as taxonomical aids. Think of a herbarium as a strict botanical library. It's exclusively dedicated to dried, heavily pressed plant specimens that are meticulously mounted on sheets and organized by universally accepted classification systems. A museum, on the other hand, is a much broader educational collection. It houses an incredible array of physical life, floating animal and plant specimens preserved in chemical jars, carefully stuffed mammals and birds, and heavy ancient stone fossils. And you know, these places are not just dusty, forgotten archives of the past. They are active, highly valuable biological vaults. Today, scientists can routinely extract intact DNA from century-old preserved specimens. This lets them track environmental changes, study lost genetic diversity, and better understand exactly how species evolved over time. As we close out this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, highly provocative thought about the ultimate biological rebels, viruses. Because viruses completely lack any cellular structure of their own and are essentially just inert protein crystals floating around outside of a specific living host, they were left entirely out of Whitaker's 5-kingdom classification system. They sit right on the absolute blurry, fascinating edge of life and non-life. It forces us to constantly question our rigid definitions and to ask, where do they truly belong in our grand library of life? Thank you so much for joining me to explore the astonishingly organized living world today.